This is a tutorial on the California Residential Purchase Agreement Car Form RPA revised 6/22, meaning June of 2022. Now it's the end of September, but this is still the newest revision of this form that we're using. I'll go through this form as if I were drafting it myself, like I'm writing an offer for a client. But we'll start at the very top here because this form is front-loaded with disclosures and advisories. So we'll go to the disclosure regarding real estate agency relationship. This is a state-required form. On the first page, you'll put the name of your buyer, your brokerage name, brokerage license, your name, your license, and both you and your buyer are going to sign this form. It's a 2-page form, but on page 2, there's nothing to do, so we'll skip through it. Now we come to the Fair Housing and Discrimination Advisory. This is also a 2-page form, but just the buyer is going to sign it. Possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. This is a 1-page form, but both you and the buyer are going to sign it. Now it has the listing agent information. You can write that in, but obviously the listing agent's not signing this particular copy of this form. Wire Fraud Advisory. 1-page form, just your buyer is going to sign it. All right, now we arrive here at the purchase agreement. Top left corner, I'm putting the date that I draft this form. Name of the buyers is going here. Street address, city, county, zip code, assessor's parcel number, which can be obtained on the MLS listing. You can log into the MLS and look at Realist or tax data that you can access through the MLS. You can ask the listing agent or the seller. You can go onto the county assessor's website and search there for a tax bill. Now, if all else fails, you can leave it blank. It's not good to, because this is a unique identifier that makes sure that in case there's an error with the address or any confusion, at least you have this number as a secondary way to identify the property. So if you can't find it now, it's fine to leave it blank, but try to get it as soon as possible and add it whenever you have it. Confirmation of agency relationships is going to go here. We're going to put the listing brokerage, the listing agent, their respective license numbers that can be found on the MLS or even the DRE's license lookup feature. Buyer's brokerage, buyer's agent, our license numbers are going here. Now, a lot of agents forget to check these boxes here. You'll want to check these boxes representing the seller, seller's agent. Now, if you're a dual agent, you'll check the dual agent box. Both. That's the dual agent. Now we arrive at the terms. All right, so keep in mind, this offer is structured in a way where it's essentially 2 parts. You have this matrix or grid, as I like to call it, that has all the terms that are extracted from the ocean of text that the old offer used to be. Because this was changed December of 2021. The old offer looked like this. Let me scroll down, because the second half of this offer is just endless text to put you right to sleep. But what has happened is the revision that came out at 12/21 and updated here 6/22, it took out those terms and made this easy to read summary, this grid up here. Now you can see that if you want to refer to a line in this grid, it's all done alphabetically. So you can refer back to E for this line, F for this line, but you'll see a second column of the paragraph that corresponds to this particular line. So if you have a question about, let's say line D1 is the earnest money deposit, you can go to paragraph 5A1 or paragraph 5 and read more about all of this. So they've extracted important terms and put them up front in the form of a grid. That's how this form is structured. We'll go through it quickly though and make it simple. Line A, purchase price, I put $1 million. 1 million as an even number. Now, if this was all cash, I would check this box, but we're going to pretend that I have a financing buyer. Close of escrow. Now, I check this box and I put 30 days because that's what is most typical. Now, you'll also see 45 days sometimes. or 60, that would be a long escrow though. But 30 is pretty typical for a financing buyer. And you'll want to ask the loan officer because really everyone's just waiting on the loan officer anyway. If this was a cash offer, you could put whatever number you want, 14 days, 10 days, even 7. But these longer numbers are due to the fact that the buyer's getting a mortgage. So ask the loan officer, consult with that person. But I'm putting 30 because that's the most typical. If you want to do a calendar date, check this box and write in the date there. Expiration. Now, by default, after 3 days, this offer will expire. You can shorten that if you want to add more pressure or lengthen it, but you can modify it down here. By default, though, it's going to be 3 days. Initial deposit amount, also known as the earnest money deposit, also known as the EMD. And that's typically between 1% to 3% of the purchase price. I was feeling generous, so I wrote in $30,000, which is 3%. It automatically puts that percentage number in for you. And by default, within 3 days, 3 business days, this is going to be sent by wire to escrow. Now, of course, this can all be changed. You can put in more or less time here or another method. I mean, even personal check is a way you could deliver an EMD to escrow. But we're going to leave it default because, again, I'm writing this offer as this. We're going through this as if I was writing this offer. So this is what I would do. I would leave it just like this. Increase deposit. Now, there are rare cases when a buyer may need to offer another deposit or more of a deposit in exchange for, let's say, more time from the seller in a transaction. Well, you check this box and add that additional deposit here, but 99% of the time, you're not going to do it. This is a very rare circumstance. So we're going to skip it and leave it blank because, again, it's very rare. Loan amount. Now, we're pretending to do an 80% loan to value, which is $800,000 of our $1 million purchase price. So that automatically calculates 80% LTV. By default, conventional financing. Now, if this is an FHA or VA loan, we're going to check those boxes there. There's a section here where you can put a percentage of the rate of the mortgage or even points. Many agents leave it blank, and I would leave it blank actually. I mean, you could put a ceiling in there, but it's not really it doesn't create really an enforceable term because you already have a loan contingency built into the contract. So there's really no point in putting it there. I mean, if you want, go for it, but I wouldn't. Or I'm not in this particular case. I'm not advising leaving it blank, but I'm showing you how I would write this. If there's a second mortgage or a seller carryback for a portion or something in addition to this first loan, you'll enter it here. Again, this is not oftenly used, but if you have a second mortgage, you'll do it right here. This is where it goes. Occupancy type. By default, this is going to be owner-occupied, primary, or if checked. Now, you can check secondary if it's a second home or investment property. I wish they wouldn't split this up, but they did. Either way, you'll check the respective box if it's not an owner-occupied property. Now, these numbers are automatically calculated. This number is just your down payment minus your earnest money deposit. And then if you add up all your loans and earnest money deposit, and this, it equals your purchase price. Again, this is automatically calculated. Buyer's going to initial, and we move on. Now, in the old form, if the seller wanted to credit the buyer, they'd have to write it in other terms or additional financing terms or some random line in an RPA. And that caused for a lot of confusion back then because sometimes an offer would get accepted and the seller and listing agent didn't even realize that somewhere in that ocean of text there was a seller credit to the buyer. And now that they're on the hook for giving that credit to the buyer. Well, here they have a nice line item, G1, where people can look to see if there is in fact a seller credit. Now I put one in here just for the sake of an example. Seller's crediting the buyer $5,000. It automatically creates how much of the purchase price. I will say that keep this in mind. If the seller's crediting any money toward the buyer and it exceeds that seller's closing costs, that money, that credit vanishes. Just a little side note, because I see this come up fairly often. So it's not like if there's some huge credit and it's more than the buyer's closing costs and the buyer gets a check for the remainder at closing. You got to have closing costs to eat up this credit. If you have questions about this or any other provision, please leave a comment. Additional finance terms. Now, if there are terms that weren't explicitly mentioned above, this is where you're going to write them in. This is an auxiliary line. Now, proper etiquette dictates that when you submit an offer to a listing agent, you should have a proof of funds for the down payment. If it's a cash purchase, you should have proof of funds for the entire purchase price. If you're getting a loan, if your buyer's getting a mortgage, then you should have a copy of the pre-approval letter from the lender included as well. That's implied here by saying attached. If not, you can check this box and say, hey, within 3 days of acceptance, we'll get that to you. But really, it should go with the original submission of the offer. This is just if you're pressed for time or the new letter hasn't come yet and you have to get that offer sent off. Final verification. Now, keep in mind, see all these numbers here and up here? If you err on the side of caution, you can leave it as the default number because in many of these cases, most of these cases, you don't have to check a box or write something in. There's already the default number for what's customary. So you can always rely on the default and you'll be just fine. 5 days to do a final walkthrough on a property prior to close of escrow. A time period for assignment requests. If the contract's being assigned, this is a very rare, unique scenario. You'll know what to do here if this pertains to your transaction. In almost all transactions, this is not relevant. Contingencies. Now, the buyer has 17 days by default for all their contingencies. You have a loan and appraisal. And if it's a cash purchase, you can just check these boxes and remove them. No loan, no appraisal contingency, or you can shorten them here. But 17 days is the default. Then you have 17 days down here for investigations, which include getting access to the property, just general investigations, reviewing the seller's documents, reviewing the title report, HOA docs, if there's a solar panel, for example, reviewing those docs, what commitment you're taking on by assuming those a solar lease or something to that effect. You can reduce or increase that number here. Sometimes people want to remove one of these, or maybe some investor wants to reduce this number down to 0. The form application won't let you, so when you hit 0, it won't let you change it. And the reason is that if you're removing any of these contingencies, you need to use a Carform CR contingency removal form. Check this box, and then note that you're removing one or all of these contingencies. And, one part I want to touch on with the appraisal. See this line right here? Sometimes I get asked by agents, what does this mean? Well, remember how our purchase price is $1 million? Ideally, the bank's appraisal will come in at $1 million. Now, if the appraisal comes in lower, that's going to create a financing issue. And ultimately, it means the buyer is going to have to pay the difference unless the seller is willing to reduce. Now, since we've been in this wild seller's market, the seller doesn't want to reduce or hasn't been reducing. And so what happens is the buyer has to pay the difference. Well, that's what this is for here. So let's say even if the appraisal comes in short, let's say instead of it coming at the $1 million purchase price, it comes in at $980. Well, you could check this box and write $980, saying that even if it's $980, the buyer will pay the difference. And it's not going to create an issue with the appraisal. Because in other circumstances, if the appraisal comes in short, then the buyer can just walk. Or they have to renegotiate with the seller. So that's what this is for. You can put a lower number than the purchase price here if the buyer is willing to pay the difference. This provision is born out of this insane seller's market where buyers are paying more than the appraised value, or the appraised value is coming in lower because we've had such rapid appreciation. Now the market's shifting as we speak, and this won't be as common, but that's what this provision is all about. If you have questions about this, leave a comment. If the buyer needs to sell their property before they can close on this one, you'll check this box and add a car form COP, meaning that the buyer is creating a contingency that they must sell their property first, or at least get into escrow, depending on how this form's filled out. Possession. Upon notice of recordation, which is odd that they use this word because no one says that. Everyone says upon notice of recording. Wonder why. Anyways, it's weird. So basically, when escrow records, they'll say, hey, we're confirmed. And escrow will say, upon recording, that they're confirmed. And that's when the buyer can take possession as the owner. Now, you can change that to a time period or some sort of less time of day, 6 p.m. on the date of recording. But if you leave it alone, which is what I would do, because upon notice of recording, I'm just going to correct that because this is a weird word that no one ever says. It just even sounds weird saying it out loud. Everyone says recording. Seller occupied or vacant units. Now, keep in mind that we've seen this a lot. Seller in possession, car form SIP, where sellers get buyers to purchase a property and then the seller gets to stay in there for a while because, again, we've been in this insane seller's market. Well, it's saying basically here, is the seller going to stay in possession? If the answer is yes, and it's going to be 29 days or fewer, you're going to check this box and you're going to attach a SIP form, or a SIP as I like to call it. And if the seller is going to be in longer than that, 30 days or more, you're going to do an RLAS, which stands for residential lease after sale. But basically, you need one of these forms done if the seller is staying in possession. That's what this is about right here. And if there are tenant-occupied units, you're going to do this, check this box, and attach the TOPA form. Now, again, by default up here, buyer's taking possession upon notice of confirmation or recording, and then this only needs to be addressed if there's someone occupying the property after recording. All right, seller has 7 days to deliver disclosures. This is fine, leave it alone. I would not change this. Unless, of course, there's like a really short cash escrow. Then I put the heat on the seller and change it to a lower number. And these are just time periods for when the seller needs to get moving on their obligations, like disclosures, installing smoke alarms or CO2 detectors. All right, let's move on. Both parties are going to initial at the bottom. This is very important here. Check as many things as possible if you're writing an offer. If a home has it or might have it, just check it. If there's something that is debatable or unique, like a fixture, because really anything that conveys with real property is something that's affixed to the premises. Now, sometimes it's disputed in terms of what is affixed or the method in which it's affixed. So you'll have things like wall-mounted brackets for video or audio. So, like for example, with TVs that are increasingly mounted to the wall, the mount stays, but the TV gets taken off. It's kind of weird. But if you want the TV to be added, you need to write it in here. If not, you're just going to end up with wall mounts and your buyer wondering who took the TV. So check as much as you can. That's the moral of the story here. If you want something that's not going to be excluded but would otherwise be affixed or included, you'll check the box and you'll write that there. That's what that is. Now, sometimes in the MLS, you'll see special instructions like a certain fixture is being removed, like a chandelier, let's say. Let's say there's a chandelier that's being taken out. I should even add bidets because bidets are becoming increasingly popular as well. A bidet toilet seat. If you're retrofitting a toilet to become a bidet, that is affixed. you're not to remove that. So that's just another thing I should mention, because that has come up in the course of me offering my advice as a broker. All right, we'll move on to allocation of costs. This is very important. These are the closing costs. NHD report required by law. This cannot be waived. This is an obligation by the state to the seller to furnish the buyer with a natural hazard disclosure. I put that the seller should pay. There should be the environmental supplement, and that should be provided by fastnhd.com. I have no idea why they put a checkbox by provided. That's silly nonsense, but I think that this was just like a copy and paste, template, or you have it provided by, but this whole check, I should have checked this box, because if it's there, you have to check it. So keep that in mind. If you write the name in somewhere and there's a box by it, you must check the box, because even if you write in the name, here I'll make an example of my typographical error. Even though I wrote in the name of a company, because I didn't check this box, this is no longer enforceable. So if another company used, or if the other brokerage or whomever ordered it, let's say escrow, used a different company instead of the one that I prefer, there's nothing I can do. I can't say, hey, well, the contract says fastnhd.com. They'd say, well, you didn't check the box. And that actually, that's a way for someone to dispute whatever provision is written in. If the box isn't checked, it doesn't stand. So learn from this mistake. Here's a really important line. If you want the seller to pay for a termite report, it should be written in here. Now, the technical term is wood-destroying organism, but no one uses that really anymore. So I wrote in termite report, and that the seller is going to pay for it. There really should be an area where you can identify which company, like a provided by, that should be down here without this silly checkbox. Because most of the time the buyer wants to say in which termite company is going to do the report and ultimately do the work. Now, sometimes buyers write in that they're doing a property inspection and that they're paying for it. And this is, it's fine to do this. I wrote it in just to show you what some people do, but it's totally unnecessary. It's not needed. Whereas this, I would say, is essential. All right. The seller should absolutely be doing the smoke alarms, CO2 detectors, and water heater bracing. That should absolutely be done by the seller. Government required point of sale inspections and reports. This gets deleted. A lot of times I see where someone will counter this out, and agents say, what does it mean? What are the implications if Q5 and Q6 have been removed? Or there's a counter that says the seller will not pay for items Q5 and Q6. And I tell them, well, basically, some cities require a point of sale inspection or even a report. And if there's a corrective action, typically it'll be unpermitted work that was done on the property. Well, the city is going to require that the seller gets permits or brings it up to code. Now, if you're in a city that requires these point of sale inspections or reports, this is important that it's addressed here. Because if not, then what's going to happen is the city's going to find out and they may come up to the buyer later. So why not just address it now? So the whole trend I see of agents deleting this is foolish in my opinion, because if the city doesn't require it, then this is all irrelevant. It doesn't apply and there's no obligation. And if it does, if the city does require it and there is corrective action, well, why on earth would the buyer pay for it? Unless it's a total tear down fixer or whatever. So either way, it should be addressed in the RPA rather than being negotiated later. Excuse me. Because most transactions are done by a home buyer that's going to occupy the property, not some flipper or investor. So if the buyer's agent lets a seller counter this out, then they're just going to come to a point where the buyer might get stuck with some crazy corrective action by the city 2 months after they close escrow, and they're going to get angry about it. So why not just deal with it here? Escrow. Who pays for escrow fees and who pays for title insurance? Well, I have this wonderful handy allocation of closing costs. And what you can learn quickly by looking at this sheet is that every county in California has their own customary allocation of closing costs. So in Southern California, it's fairly universal that the seller pays for both the seller pays for title insurance, the owner's title policy, and then the escrow fee is split by both parties. Now, I'll link to this in the description of the video, and you can use that. But we're going to fill this out as if we're in Southern California, and we're going to have the seller pay for the owner's title policy, and we're going to have each pay their own for escrow. And that's how it's done in Southern California. In Northern California, it's any of this. So best to just know what's customary for your local area or refer to the sheet that I'll link to in the description. Same with county transfer tax and city transfer tax, which you can see here. County transfer, city transfer. In Southern California, though, not all cities require this, by the way. Counties do. But in either case, in Southern California, you'll want to have the seller pay for both. We have the seller paying for HOA transfer fees. By default, the seller's paying for any private transfer fees. This is good that it's here by default. If you want to have your client pay for your transaction coordinator or your brokerage fee, you could write brokerage processing fee, or this actually could be better constructed, but you could put $400 TC fee buyer and pass on a cost to your client. That's a separate topic though. Home warranty, you can check seller, cost not to exceed, you just put in $800. I like to use First American. That's what I'd probably put in down here. The reason is that I can just go onto First American's website for their warranty, just their warranty I'm referring to. So you go onto their home warranty website and you can price it out pretty quickly based on the property to see how much you want to put as a number here for the max number of what the seller's willing to pay. Then you have auxiliary lines in case you need to add something that wasn't already mentioned above. And both parties are going to initial. We move on. Now here we come down to the part of the agreement that's just this endless sea of text that relates back to all those provisions in the grid up above. But again, we're making this easy as if you're writing an offer alongside me by going through this. So we're not going to spend too much time on this because you'll know that if you have a unique situation and you need to add a form, you're going to see here. So you just skim through here. Is this a probate? Is this a manufactured home? Are there tenants involved? Is there a septic tank? I mean, if you see these words here, you'll know to incorporate the form. This will literally take 10 seconds for you to scan through visually to see if any of the words here relate to your transaction. And then down here, this is all boilerplate text, talking about the deposit, talking about loans. I mean, this is just an expansion on the provisions that we addressed in the grid above. So as someone writing an offer, I'm scrolling through it. That's it. I'm having my buyer initial each page eventually when I load this into DocuSign. I'm scrolling through. The reason this exists is because there's always what ifs. What if the deposit isn't delivered within 3 business days? What are the seller's rights to cancel withholding taxes? These are statutory advisories. More about PUDs and HOAs. And so all this is just an expansion of the provisions above, because if one of those provisions comes in dispute, you can rely on all this text and having the remedy or the course of action to seek a remedy. You're going to have initial areas again. We're scrolling through. The hard part's over, guys. More areas for initials. Scrolling through. Oh my gosh, look at all this. Initials. Initials. We're on page 13 of 16. More initials. Liquidated damages. The seller can keep up to 3% of the purchase price, which is that deposit that I put up on top, the earnest money deposit, if the buyer breaches. That means basically if the contingencies, all the contingencies have been removed and the buyer still doesn't perform, they could lose their deposit. Parties are going to initial here. There's a clause for mediation as a first course of action if there's a dispute that arises. Now that automatically goes into effect. There's also an arbitration clause here because if mediation fails, arbitration is the next course of action to avoid going to court. So both parties should initial there. So if I'm doing this on this page, 14 of 16, I'm going to have my buyer initial 3 places here, here, and here. And then I'm going to move on and have my buyer sign here. If it's a trust or LLC or corporation or whatever, an entity, let's call it an entity, as opposed to just an individual, I'm going to check this box here. I'm going to do a separate form, CAR form RCSD, representative capacity signature disclosure, which basically authorizes an individual, let's say Bob Buyer, to sign on behalf of his corporation or trust or whatever. And if that's the case, the name of the buyer should be the name of the entity, not the name of the individual. If you have any questions, leave a comment. And then I'll have my buyer sign. This is where the seller will sign to accept or counter. Either way, the seller's got to sign. And then this is where I would sign as an agent. And this is where escrow is going to acknowledge who they are. And then the buyer's going to initial again. Now, just when you thought we were done with disclosures and advisories, ta-da, we have more at the end of the agreement. Buyer's investigation advisory, 2-page form. Buyer's going to sign, but wait, there's more. Fair Appraisal Act addendum. Buyer's going to sign. California Consumer Privacy Act advisory. Buyer's going to sign, and we are done. That's it. That's how I'd write an offer. If I just sat down and had to write an offer quickly but properly, this is exactly what I do. If you have any questions, please leave a comment. Thank you for watching.